everything about electric and how electrics are going to take over the two-wheeler industry, and the time frames are from anywhere from 5 years to 10 years and all. But I think I'd like to remind most of you, if you were around in this two-wheeler industry 15 years ago, there was a similar push from the government for alternate fuel usage. And still, there's only about 5% penetration of alternate fuels in any segment you see. I think Maruti took the lead for that. Three-wheelers use it, two-wheelers don't use it. But there's a difference I would like to highlight between that initiative and this one, in that during that time, all the stakeholders, all the ecosystem had a business case. The kit supplier, the component supplier, the OEM, the tank, the fuel supplier, everybody had a business case and it could be easily penetrable. It did not happen because of infrastructure. Now, for the last 3 years, we are hearing that electrics will take over because I read the FAME document in 2016. I did not read it now, the FAME 2. But I'd like to remind the FAME 1 document. It said in 2020, there'll be 6 to 7 million electric vehicles on the road. I think there's about 60,000. So, so what's the difference here? Why didn't it come up? And why would FAME 2 be more successful? So I'd like to define the problem first. It's not just about the fuel usage. It's not just about the pollution only. It's not just about electric vehicles. First thing is environmental pollution. Yes, it is there due to automobiles. There's also fossil fuel usage. We are a net importer of fossil fuel. So energy security is a big question mark if we depend on that. There's also global warming because of carbon dioxide from this. And the last thing is urbanization. We talked about urbanization, moving the motorcycles to scooters. Yes, that would happen. But urbanization also generates a lot of garbage. We don't have a solution to treating that yet in this country, but that's a real problem. Then from an electric vehicle point of view, the technology was developed in cold countries. India has more than 35 degrees centigrade temperature, almost 80% of the country and 80% of the time. The lithium-ion battery on which we are depending is useless beyond 35 degrees. The charging-discharging characteristics are just not acceptable. Is that the solution that we are going to depend on for this great leap into electrics? The other thing is, we said in the morning that electric vehicles would be clean. Yes, it would be clean, but the pollution would be elsewhere as long as we depend on 70% thermal power. When is the thermal power going to go to renewables? It's also a question mark. So is EV the answer? I would like to show you a schematic. I had done this last night in a hurry. But if you see, there are going to be certain trigger points for changes in the next decade or so. If I lay out the timeline on the horizontal axis, and then the vertical axis has, let's say, the growth of different segments. Mind you, these are not true numbers, but these are trends. I'm still working the numbers. The first thing that you will see, I don't know if you can read that, is that people have talked about it, is the scooter segment is growing due to urbanization and a lot of women joining not just the workforce, but mobility. People who are not working, students, for example, are also joining that bandwagon of mobility, but using scooters. It will continue. And also, if you see, as the roads get better, motorcycles will give way to scooters. So even the men will start using scooters. So one of the questions in the morning about road quality, motorcycles in the rural area exist because of poor road quality. The moment the road quality improves, they'll turn to scooters. The second thing is, if you notice, BS6 is coming up, and that will increase the costs of this low-end commuting solution, and you're going to see a dip a temporary dip when 2020 happens. I think 2019 also it will happen because of additional content from the CBS and ABS. Another trend that we have seen is there's this electrification slowly happening. You have seen all these e-rickshaws mushroom up. You have seen the e-scooters coming up. The e-scooters and e-rickshaws, there's a difference I'd like to point out. E-rickshaws are selling more, but with no subsidy. So that's a better business model. E-scooters are selling because of subsidy. Take out the subsidy and it'll die. There was an example, I think almost 10 years back, Electrotherm was almost selling 40,000 scooters a year with subsidy. The year the subsidies were taken out, the next year was zero. So that's not a sustainable business model. It has to change someday. So for 3 years, I think we can look forward to a little increase in electric two-wheelers. The next trigger item that is coming is probably after this BS6 emission, there will be another emission norm. And that, I think, would be mostly governing the CO2. And that means the IC engines have to get more fuel efficient. This may drive hybrids, and it may drive some other technologies also. So those are some of the near-term triggers for some of the trends in growth that I'm going to show you. So the first thing is, if you see the black line is what I call I call it the heat engines, not the IC engines, for a reason. So let me just say IC engines for the time being. The IC engines will grow. BS6 comes, there will be a small dip, and then it will start growing again. That's the natural economy growing, because the EVs are not keeping pace because of lack of infrastructure, lack of a tropical battery, and so lack of a value proposition, true value proposition. It will depend on subsidy. Whereas if you look at the EV, they will be 2019, 2020, because of FAME, you will see an uptick in EVs. And then as the subsidy goes, somewhere there the subsidy has to go, 3 years, maybe 5 years, subsidy has to go, right? When the subsidy goes, it will flatten out. And then as the CO2 limits come, it will see an uptick again. The timing we can, say a few years here and there. Since I don't know when the CO2 norms are coming, I couldn't pinpoint the timing, but those are the events that will drive the uptick in EVs. So if somebody of you has a plan to get into electrics, how do you do that? How do you make that market entry? Because you can't depend on subsidies for your business. So the first thing is that play in the subsidized segment. That is to understand the market, understand the user needs, understand the challenges, and develop the value proposition. So there is a development time for developing that value proposition. Since hybrids are going to come because of CO2. When I say hybrids, these are not the kind of hybrids that you see in cars. These are hybrids which have an onboard charging system, so you don't have to plug it in for charging. So those kind of technologies people are working on. So there's a lead time to development for those kind of technologies to mature. I expect that to happen in the next 3 to 5 years. The next thing is, as the CO2 norm comes in, you have a choice. You can launch, if you still are in IC engines, because the ecosystem supports that, a hybrid makes better sense than an electric. It also will have a value proposition if it's an onboard charging hybrid. And then, that is also the time you have understood what the customer needs are. Hopefully, we have developed what I call a tropical battery, a battery that is right for these temperature conditions. And the battery costs come down, as we are all hoping. When that happens, you're ready to launch the EVs without the subsidy. So that's the right roadmap. But this is all true if we only put our right blinders on and say electric, electric, electric. People around the world are discussing many other technologies that are exciting for this country. Let's take a look at that. What will stop? I mean, what I said is what will drive electrics, but what will also pull the electric growth down is, number one, charging infrastructure. That was the reason why alternate fuel still hasn't come up 15 years. So if charging infrastructure doesn't come up, we won't see that penetration of 30% somebody talked about in 10 years. The other thing is power generation from thermal sources has to move to renewables. At least 80% of the power generated in India has to go to renewables. Today is only 30%, that's all this hydro. And the plan to penetrate with solar is also inadequate. Mind you, solar can only be a rural phenomena because in urban areas, the amount of energy consumed per square feet is much more than the amount of energy the sun gives per square feet. So it can't be an urban solution. It can only be a rural solution. So there's a big gap in power generation going to renewables. Those in the world who are talking about electrification by 2030 and all have already gone to 100% power generation from renewables. But there they have the advantage of wind sources. The other thing that I would like to throw in here is what are some of the technologies being developed outside of India, unfortunately, but we can always leverage that, which has relevance to this two-wheeler industry. Sorry, so this is how if charging infrastructure comes up and the thermal power generation goes to renewables, you will see the IC engine-driven vehicles go down. That's a black dotted line, and the EVs go up. That's a big if. So this is how the scenario will pan out. There is another scenario, and that is, if you see, one of the technologies that I'm quite interested in is, I think the minister, Mr. Gadkari, also talked about it in the SIIT show, is methane. Methane from biomass or garbage. If that technology already exists on a small scale, if the production of that scales up, which is quite possible in India because of the large source of biomass here, and we are not talking about fuel versus food because this is post-food processing biomass. The technology exists. If that is scaled up, your IC engine gets a new lease of life. There are people working on more efficient IC engines. You will see that probably in 3 to 5 years from now. IC engines which are 25 to 40% more efficient than today's. Those can do with the non-fossil fuel methane as a source of energy. 10 years from now, quite possible. Another technology that is very interesting, I like it very much, is a liquid nitrogen. That's why I call it heat engine. The same IC engine, instead of combustion, if you take a very cold liquid at minus 150 degrees centigrade, mix it with ordinary water, the heat change from minus 170 degrees centigrade to room temperature is so large that they say the expansion is as good or better than the combustion you get from fossil fuels. So the same IC engines, you can use liquid nitrogen to run it. No new additional infrastructure. Only question is, how costly will be the liquid nitrogen? Today, liquid nitrogen costs almost the same as petrol. So all one has to do is produce more liquid nitrogen. Nitrogen is the most abundant source, abundant element available in the atmosphere. It's inert, so there's no CO2, there's no CO, there's no HC. Wonderful technology. And these can extend the IC, probably even kill the EV if the charging infrastructure and renewable source don't come. So that scenario would look like that. The dotted line on the EV goes down, and the solid line on the IC engine goes up. So there are these scenarios that can happen in 10 to 15 years. So for those of you who are worried about spare parts, tires, all that goes into the IC engine-driven vehicle, there's good news. The bad news is we in India are not looking to these things. People outside of India are developing these kind of technologies because the market is here, right? So we can utilize these things. So I would like to summarize very quickly. The EV penetration depends on several things which are a challenge today. Tropical battery development, that means battery that gives excellent performance in the temperature range that this climate or this country has. A tremendous expectation of cost reduction and renewable energy generation. All those three have to fall in place for the EV to have a good business case. There are other emerging technologies. I talked about methane and liquid nitrogen, just two of them which I find use in the two-wheeler industry. That has a better potential to solve the energy security because we'll no longer import petroleum or lithium or high-power magnets for the motors in the EVs. It will use existing investments in the IC engine industry. That's why I called it heat engines, because it won't be internal combustion anymore. There won't be any pollution. So with that, I would like to just end this talk. There's enough food for thought. Look forward to your questions later. Thank you very much for your attention.